The house sat on a low ridge at the edge of a small Carolina town. White paint sunburnt to chalk, porch boards cupping like old hands. My father used to call it high ground. I called it home. After 12 years and 2 deployments, I came back carrying one duffel and a habit I couldn't shake. Note first, speak later. In the Marines, I was a communications chief. I learned to listen to static until the truth separated from the noise. That doesn't turn off when you hand in a uniform. I parked at 0800 hours. The breeze pushed oak leaves across the gravel like slow water. The workshop door hung open. A new deadbolt flashed bright where the wood was still raw. Someone had changed the lock on my father's bench. I stepped up onto the porch and saw a paper wedged in the screen door. Notice of intended sale. County letterhead. A law firm I'd never met. The date was last week. Buyer listed as TBD. It felt like walking into a room where a conversation had started without me and was about to end me. Inside, the air still held my father's aftershave, faint as memory. The living room was cleared except for a folded Marine Corps flag framed above the mantel. He retired it the day my mother died. Wouldn't fly it in bad weather. He said a flag should never have to endure what a man should stand for. A car door slammed. I turned and saw my sister, Laura, coming up the walk in heels made for courtrooms, not gravel. We hadn't talked much. Distance widens without either person moving. She hugged me, stiff, and looked past my shoulder into the house like she was measuring it. "It's complicated," she said, almost before hello. "There are taxes. The will. It wasn't straightforward. I've been handling it." I kept my voice low. "What are you handling exactly?" "Responsibility. You were gone, Dan. Somebody had to make decisions." A second car pulled in. A man in a blue suit climbed out, case under his arm. He introduced himself as the estate attorney. He said words that had edges. Probate, reassignment, caretaker rights. His tone made it sound like mercy. His eyes did not. I listened. "I've learned to let people tell me who they are." He handed me a packet. A notarized transfer dated 2 weeks after Dad's funeral. Laura's signature, not mine. The justification line read, "Primary caregiver and occupant." My father's scrawl appeared in a photocopied codicil. Witness lines blank, margins smudged where ink bled from cheap toner. I looked for the stamp, the registration number, the county filing date. I found them. What I didn't find was my father's voice. I said nothing. Silence is not surrender. It is a container where truth can settle. He kept talking. Timelines, maintenance costs, best outcomes. He slid a consent form toward me like a dealer sliding chips. I didn't touch it. When you've handled encrypted keys and emergency call signs, you learn the weight of a signature. The wrong one is heavier than a rucksack. "I need time," I said. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Of course. That afternoon I checked into the Valley Motel off Route 9. Cigarette burns on the comforter, air that hummed from a hard-worked unit. I set my field notebook on the table and wrote the first entry. 1500 hours, returned to family property. Observed change of locks, posted sale notice, alleged transfer. Objective, verify father's intent, protect estate until verified. Old habits stayed useful. At the diner, people recognized me. The cook nodded with that small-town nod that holds welcome and caution. Whispers carry better than AM radio in places like this. By sundown, the story would travel from booth to feed store. The Marine came home to a for sale sign. He thought I'd be too tired to fight. That evening, I walked the perimeter of the property like it was a fence line in Hellmand. Tracks in the dirt, fresh tire marks by the workshop. A coffee cup left on the sawhorse, still damp at the lip. The lock change hadn't been for me. It was for photographers and appraisers. In the garage, tucked behind a coil of orange extension cord, I found an old olive ammo can my father used for papers. Inside, receipts, yellowed warranty cards. A Polaroid of me in dress blues with his arm around my shoulder. On the back, in the pencil he used for crosswords, a line. For the one who kept his word. No date, no signature, not a legal instrument, just the texture of a man's intention. It wasn't enough. Not yet. I slept lightly, the way you sleep when you know movement will happen at first light. At 0600 hours, I returned with coffee. Watched as a county truck rolled up and 2 men began measuring the lot line. "Assessment," one said when I asked. "Potential sale." He was polite, efficient, uninterested in history. Tape lines don't hear stories. I took pictures, license plates, timestamps, the measurements they called out. Not because I planned to argue about feet and inches, but because records win when memories are pushed aside. He assumed I didn't remember what a will is supposed to look like. That afternoon I went to the courthouse. The clerk was kind in the way small-town clerks are when they've known your father's face. She told me the estate file was sealed pending dispute. I asked to see public access portions, initial filings, notices, stamps. She slid copies through the glass. I noted the protocol number, the date, the seal. I noted the timeline. 2 weeks from funeral to transfer. Fast. I wrote down the names of the witnesses who signed the transfer. I didn't know either. When I left, the square looked the way it had when I was a kid. Brick, pharmacy, barber, church. Familiar, but rotated. Like someone had spun it a quarter turn while I was overseas. I came home looking for quiet. Quiet had rules. Quiet demanded proof. I drove back to the ridge at dusk. The house held its breath in blue light. I stood on the porch and pictured my father checking the flag on days when storms were building. He'd touch the rope and look at the sky and decide it could wait. Not everything that flaps needs to fly. He believed the house would stay with the one who understood silence better than argument. He believed I was that man. The law didn't care what he believed. The law wanted what it could stamp. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't plead. I wrote another line in the notebook. 1900 hours, primary mission unchanged. Obtain evidence of intent. Hold ground. But I still didn't know what Laura had already put in motion. Part 2, 800 words. By the end of the week, my name and my house were breakfast conversation. The diner cut my toast a little thicker. Like sympathy came in wedges. The hardware store owner offered a discount I didn't need. Small town's soft shoe around pain. They never stop watching it. Laura called at 0930. You're making this harder than it has to be. Her voice had that studied calm people learn when they spend time with lawyers. There are tax liens you don't even know about. I've protected this place for years. It's time to let it go. I kept my tone level. Where's Dad's final will, Laura? The one he signed with witnesses he trusted? It's in the file. You can ask the court for a copy. Silence. Then the tilt. But you don't have grounds. We both knew grounds were a matter of paperwork, not blood. I went to the bank where Dad kept his safe deposit box. The manager, Mrs. Vaughn, remembered his habit of bringing peanuts for the tellers. She frowned when she checked the system. Box was accessed twice in the month after his passing, she said. Executor authority. She tapped the screen, looked up with apology. Your sister had the key and court letter. I asked for the access log. She could give me the dates, not the contents. She printed the slips. Weak proof, the number 1. Timing and access. Suggestive, not decisive, contestable. It showed activity where grief should have been the only movement. He thought timing wouldn't matter. Outside, I called Carl Jennings, an old yardman who worked repair with my father at the shipyard before Dad retired. Carl remembered a conversation back in 2014 where Dad said he wanted to add my name to the deed when the boys back stateside. Carl swore he saw a draft template on the kitchen table. County form, blanks unfilled. But he never saw a filing receipt. Oral memory, no paper. It was a shadow that pointed at a shape. I logged it all. Names, dates, the weather. People underestimate weather in testimony. It helps memory anchor. That day the wind had a marsh smell. The sky was a flat tin lid. Late afternoon, a pickup idled by the house. A man and a woman took interior pictures through the glass, hands cupped against glare. I walked up and asked who hired them. Listing prep, the man said. We were told it was clear. He looked embarrassed, as if decency belonged to him and he'd misplaced it. They left fast. I took photos of their plates. I didn't tell them anything. I needed a court, not a confrontation. But I still went to see the estate attorney. His office sat above a gift shop, diplomas arranged like a formation on his wall. He offered me water. I declined. He used the phrase, best interests of the estate, 3 times in 2 minutes. I asked to examine the will's chain of custody. He said it was in order. I asked for the names of the witnesses who signed the transfer of the house. He named 2 I didn't recognize, neighbors from the far side of town. I asked when the codicil was drafted. He said, shortly after hospice consult. and watched my face for the flinch. He didn't get one. Your sister carried the weight here, he said. You were deployed. I was serving, I said. There's a difference. The air in the room went cool. He smiled in a way that asked me to be reasonable. Reasonable means quiet in places like that. I already was. I left with nothing I could hold up in court. But sometimes the gap in the record is the record. The dates felt wrong, too quick, too clean. Grief is messy. Paper this neat smelled like bleach. He assumed I'd fatigue and sign. Back at the motel, I spread out the pages on the bedspread and sorted by date, not category. Patterns show differently when time is the ruler. Every action had a velocity. 2 weeks from funeral to transfer. 1 week from lock change to assessment. Photos ordered before notice served. I outlined in pencil what I could prove and what I only suspected. I circled the seam where suspicion could become evidence. At 0:20 hours, I stopped by the workshop and stood in the doorway. Dust motes swam in a shaft of evening light. My father's bench was neat, tools oiled, each in its place. He wasn't a man who left sharp edges upturned. Whatever he wanted, he wrote somewhere. He didn't shout his wishes. He recorded them. If he recorded them, I could find them. The next morning, I went to the county records office, not to argue, but to observe. The clerk, a young man with nervous hands, recognized my last name and overcompensated with formality. He told me again that the file was sealed. I asked for the access logs for the estate file. Who checked it out, when, under what authority? He hesitated, then said logs were public record. He printed them and slid them across the counter without looking up. 3 entries after sealing. 1 from the attorney of record. 2 under L.T. Cole. No attached court orders authorizing her access. The line item landed like a quiet hammer. Still not the will. Still not the deed. But it moved the needle from rumor to record. He thought the door he opened would leave no footprints. I thanked the clerk and left. No triumph, just the kind of calm you feel when the map matches the ground for the first time. Outside, the square was busy, school buses shrinking in the distance. A dog asleep under a bench like a piece of forgotten clothing. Ordinary life continued. That's the hardest part of any fight. The world keeps going as if your war is just weather. I wrote a new objective. Acquire a forensic look at the digital file. Metadata is a diary nobody thinks they're keeping. If the will had been touched after my father died, time would have signed the forgery for me. I had one more call to make. A friend from the old days. A man who knew how to read what machines confess when people refuse to. Part 3. 800 words. His name was Frank Delaney. We'd shared a bunker in a winter worse than it had to be. He retired as a sergeant major, the kind whose voice could drill holes in steel. And then he softened it into a trade. Digital forensics, chain of custody audits, quiet work where the truth is shy. I called at 0700. He answered on the first ring. What's wrong, Cole? He always skipped hello. My father's will, I said. The file smells wrong. I need eyes on metadata and access trails. He didn't say sorry. He said, text me the protocol number, the county system, and what you already have. That's respect where we come from. Assume the man has done his homework. Frank drove down from Raleigh the next morning in a truck that looked like it had earned its dents. He set a thermos on the motel desk and pulled a rugged laptop from a case foam cut for each device like a surgeon's kit. We spread my notes across the table. Access logs from the records office, bank slips, the assessment schedule, the copy of the transfer Laura signed, the codicil photocopy. He scanned the access log and tapped it. This is your hinge, he said. If the file's sealed and she touched it without an order, either there's a second authorization you haven't seen or someone misused credentials. He requested official copies through a public records request with timeframes precise to the minute. Chain of custody lives or dies on timestamps. He came with forms ready. He always does. While we waited for responses, we drove to the courthouse. I didn't bring a lawyer. I wasn't making a scene. We met with the judge's assistant. Efficient, kind, guarded. Frank explained, wearing his consultant hat, that we needed to compare the hash value of the digital will currently on file with the first recorded version. If they differed, we'd ask for an evidentiary hearing. She listened like someone who knew where this might go. She gave us a date, 1 week out. A short hearing, not a trial. Enough to open a door. I exhaled carefully. Patience is a weapon. It's also a shield. That afternoon, a reply arrived from the county IT officer. Uncomfortable emails always read stiff. They attached an audit report. The estate PDF had 2 last modified entries. One matched the day my father signed the original. 2 witnesses, both different from the transfer names I'd been given. The other, last modified, was stamped 2 days after his death. The user field listed a generic workstation ID tied to Clerk Terminal 3. Clerks change. Terminals don't. Frank nodded slowly. Proof number 2, he said. Objective, a post-mortem modification. Now we need proof number 3 to triangulate. Someone saw a version or event that fits these timestamps, or we find a storage device with the pre-edit hash. We drove to see Mrs. Vaughn at the bank again. Frank asked permission to view only the access protocol for the safe deposit box on the days surrounding the second modification. No contents, just security pattern. She printed the log like she was opening a door carefully. The box had been accessed the morning of the modification by executor authority, Laura, with a notary present. That didn't prove wrongdoing. It did prove opportunity. He highlighted the time, 09:22 hours. The modification stamp read 09:58 hours. Distance from bank to courthouse, 15 minutes. He thought proximity wouldn't be noticed. We needed a witness with clean eyes. Carl Jennings pointed us to a neighbor who sometimes helped my father with the yard when his knees hurt, a quiet deacon named Walter. He remembered coming by the day before the funeral. He'd found Laura at the kitchen table with a man he didn't recognize. Papers laid out, Dad asleep in the next room. He didn't read the papers. He did remember her saying, "We need to move quickly." Walter was careful with his words. He refused to sign anything he hadn't lived. Frank thanked him and didn't push. Even cautious testimony helps the shape of a case. It tells a judge your story isn't invented, it's simply incomplete. At the motel, Frank assembled a report the way he used to assemble a field order. Headings, bulletproof language, minimal adjectives. He documented the record access anomalies, the post-mortem edit, the box access window, and his credentials. He attached the county IT audit and the clerk log. He printed the packet, numbered the pages, and we both initialed the bottom of each like the old days. 2-man integrity. He also wrote a 1-page affidavit that he could swear to under penalty of perjury. He didn't waste ink. We filed it with the court the next morning at 0800 hours. The assistant scheduled us before lunch. Laura and her attorney would be notified. The property transactions would not be frozen yet. That required a judge's order. But the hearing date put a brake on momentum. Sales hate daylight. I walked the ridge and listened for the sounds I grew up with. Summer insects building to a thin roar. Far-off laughter from a baseball field. A chain slapping a flagpole, loose metal talking to wind. I tried to remember the way my father's hand felt when he checked the tension on that rope every evening. If you keep it too tight, the fabric tears. Too loose, and the flag wraps itself and forgets who it is. He trusted me with the balance. Laura came to the motel that evening, the attorney at her elbow. She stood by the door, did not sit. "You filed something," she said. "I filed the truth I can prove," I said. "You're going to humiliate me." "I'm going to protect what he asked me to protect." Her attorney took a step forward. "Mr. Cole, if you continue, we'll seek to recover costs and damages for delay. My client has—" Frank spoke from the bathroom doorway where he'd been rinsing coffee cups. "You'll do what you think protects your client. We'll do what we know protects the record." They left without slamming the door. That's how you know people think they're winning. They don't need noise to feel tall. I didn't celebrate. I wrote in the notebook, 0-2000, hearing scheduled, proof number 2 and number 3 aligned, objective, freeze estate actions, compel an audit, restore original intent. The night was clean and cold. I slept like I used to before patrol, a shallow drift with the weight of the gear already on. He believed I'd break before the clock did. He hadn't met my silence. Part 4, 800 words. The courthouse always felt the same. Cool air, brown benches, the smell of paper and coffee. At 0900 hours, the clerk called our case. Cole versus Cole, estate record review. I rose when my name was spoken. Old reflex. You stand when you are called. Laura sat across the aisle with her attorney, polished like a new coin. Frank took a place behind me, not at counsel table, because we weren't making this a performance. The judge was a man who looked like a high school coach, sleeves a little short, eyes that kept score. He read our filing, then looked at me. "Mr. Cole, you're not represented." "No, Your Honor," I said. "I'm here to present specific anomalies and request a narrow remedy." "Proceed." I kept it simple. In radio, words cost time. Evidence A. County access log indicating that after the estate file was sealed, it was accessed 3 times. One entry by the attorney of record, I nodded toward the table, and 2 entries by L.T. Cole, without any attached court order authorizing access. Evidence B. County IT audit showing the digital will file has 2 last modified timestamps. The second modification occurred 2 days after date of death. Evidence C. Bank safe deposit access record noting executor access 36 minutes before the second modification timestamp. Evidence D. Affidavit from Sergeant Major, Retender, Frank Delaney, digital forensics consultant, verifying hash discrepancies and chain of custody observations. I placed the packet on the ledge. The judge flipped pages without hurrying. The room's noise shuttered down until you could hear the HVAC breathe. Laura's attorney objected on foundation and scope. He called metadata unreliable in consumer systems. Frank stood when the judge asked if he wished to be heard. He explained in calm language how file systems record modification events, how hash values work, how a mismatch is not a feeling but a fact. The judge asked one question. "Mr. Delaney, could this be a simple clerical correction? A staple removed, a page scanned twice, anything innocent?" "It could, Your Honor," Frank said. "That is why we are not asking for a conclusion, only for a freeze and an audit with proper chain of custody to determine whether content changed and by whom. Reason speaks softly when it's strong." Laura's attorney pivoted to motive. He said I'd been absent, that my sister had carried the weight, that I was here for value, not values. He said the codicil proved caretaker priority. He held up a photocopy like a lantern. I didn't glance at Laura. I kept my eyes on the judge. "Your Honor, the codicil lacks a verifiable witness signature that matches the witness names on record. The margin initials differ from my father's known hand. I'm not asking you to decide that today. I'm asking you to protect the integrity of the record while it's checked." He studied me longer than he had studied the paper. "Decision is a shape that shows in the shoulders before it reaches the mouth. Motion to freeze pending audit is granted," he said. "No sale, no transfer, no encumbrance until audit completion. The court appoints an independent examiner to review the file system, compare hashes to the earliest capture, and report back in 14 days. Additionally, the clerk's office will review access authorization procedures and produce a chain of custody report. Parties may submit supplemental affidavits within 7 days. The gavel didn't bang. It clicked. The sound was small and absolute. The room went silent. Laura didn't look at me as she gathered papers. She stood in a way I recognized from childhood. Chin high, jaw set, eyes on a horizon she refused to admit was moving. Her attorney whispered. She nodded. They left with backs straight. Pride can carry a person farther than truth for a while, not forever. Outside, the sun felt too bright for the cool air. Frank clapped my shoulder once. "That's the turn," he said. "You didn't win anything yet. You just made sure nothing gets stolen while we're checking the locks." I nodded. Victory is an illusion until the paperwork agrees. We spent the afternoon preparing the supplemental packet. We included a 1-paragraph statement from Walter, careful and spare. We added Carl's recollection with a note on its limited evidentiary weight. We attached copies of the assessment schedule and the photographer invoice request Laura had emailed a contractor. Discovered only because the contractor, embarrassed, had CC'd me after our porch conversation. The pattern wasn't criminal proof. It was human proof, urgency out of step with grief. He thought the quiet wouldn't keep score. During those 14 days, I worked the house. Not to improve it for court, but to remind myself what I was protecting. I replaced a porch board. I oiled the hinges on the workshop door and put the deadbolt back the way my father would have. Clean cuts, no splinters. Neighbors slowed their cars and lifted hands. Some stopped to apologize for what they'd assumed. I told them assumptions are normal in a small town. They keep people from asking questions that feel like stepping on graves. A week in, Laura called, the first time without her attorney. She spoke plainly. "If the audit goes badly, you'll make me look like a thief." I'm asking the record to speak, I said. If the record doesn't find anything, I'll accept that too. You won't, she said. Then, quieter. You always loved him in a way that made the rest of us look small. I didn't answer. Love isn't an accusation. It's a weight you carry without needing anyone to admire it. The examiner's report arrived on a Monday at 0800 hours. It was precise. The second modification had replaced a page in the will with one containing a changed disposition clause for the house, shifting it from joint custodianship to vested in caretaker until sale. The hash differed. The login used was a general clerk terminal. Security footage for the hour in question had a gap due to a camera reboot. Procedure had been followed poorly, not maliciously, until content changed. The examiner did not ascribe motive or name a person. He wrote only what he could prove. Truth doesn't fear a blank where a name should be. The judge set a follow-up hearing for Friday. He asked both parties to attend. We did. The finding was read into the record. He restored the original disposition in the interim and ordered a full review of any transfer based on the altered page. He warned, without theatrics, that further manipulation of court records would elevate the matter from civil to criminal referral. He looked at me and then at Laura. If there is mercy to be practiced in this family, practice it now, he said. This court will not tolerate mercy's absence on paper. When we stepped out into late light and wind, the flag at the courthouse cracked smartly, then fell back, then snapped again. You don't control gusts. You can control how you stand. The turn had come. I didn't crow. I wrote a single line that night. Hold ground. Let daylight complete the work. Part 5. 800 words. The audit widened like a slow river after rain. Over 2 weeks, the examiner traced keystrokes, compared scans, interviewed clerks, and followed a thin thread from the bank to the courthouse to the attorney's office printer. It found what I suspected but wouldn't say, a moment where grief and pressure bent a choice, and a page got replaced in the belief that ends justify means. Names lived in the confidential annex. The judge kept his word. No spectacle, only correction. The court reinstated my father's original will in full. The house returned to joint custodianship between Laura and me, as he intended. The judge ordered remedial training in chain of custody for the clerk's office and a referral to the bar for a quiet conversation with the attorney who'd been too casual with best interests. He left it at that. Discipline where it mattered, dignity where it could be saved. I didn't ask for damages. I didn't ask for costs. I didn't need the court to punish my sister. Justice isn't a whip you swing until it breaks. It's a level you set and protect. Some nights I slept at the house, windows open, crickets insisting on themselves. I put the flag back on the oak rope at dawn. I raised it slow, not to say victory, but to say continuity. I saluted once. No audience, no ceremony. A salute is a private covenant before it is a public sign. Laura drove up a week later. She stayed in the car at first, engine ticking as it cooled. When she stepped out, she looked older and smaller at the same time. Like grief and relief were fighting, and both were losing. She held an envelope. She handed it to me without speaking. Inside was a letter my father had written the winter I deployed the second time. He'd tucked it into a book of my mother's on a shelf that Laura took after the funeral. The letter wasn't a will. It was better. It said, "If I'm not around when you come home, take care of your sister by taking care of this place with her. It will keep you both honest." He had underlined with. She had found the letter too late to remember in time. Or maybe she had found it and couldn't bear what it asked. I don't know. I didn't interrogate her. Cross-examining family may satisfy a short hunger. It doesn't feed anything that lives. We stood by the porch my father built when our knees were skinned and our fights were about who got the bigger glass of lemonade. "I'm sorry," she said. No theater. No justifications. "I know," I said. "Will you sell?" Her voice held more fear than hope. "Not now," I said. "Maybe someday together, for the right reason. But I won't sell to solve a feeling." She nodded. I thought losing it would hurt less if I did it fast. "Fast is loud," I said. "Loud doesn't heal." We didn't hug. We didn't need to. Some closeness returns like a retired tool, oiled, quiet, useful when called for, otherwise respectful enough to stay where it's kept. I repaired the workshop roof one weekend, laying shingles in the hot hum of summer. A neighbor kid stopped and asked if I needed help. I handed him a hammer and showed him how to set nails without bending them. You pass on steadiness one hit at a time. He asked if I'd been a soldier. I said Marine. He asked if I'd seen war. I said I'd seen people do hard things for each other. He seemed satisfied. Sometimes the truest answer is a new angle, not a new fact. The town shifted as towns do when a rumor dies. The diner stopped cutting my toast thick. The hardware store quit offering discounts. That's how you know they've let you back into the general population. Pain is no longer your name tag. On a Saturday, I opened my father's ammo can for the last time. I organized what mattered, deed, insurance, tax receipts, into fresh folders. I labeled them in block letters and logged the protocol numbers. I placed the Polaroid of us in the front of the box. I added my notebook to the can, pages filled with dates and wins and names. A house is wood and wires. A home is the record you keep when nobody is watching. Frank came by on his way to a job out west. We sat on the porch and didn't talk much. He looked at the flag, then at the ridge. "You did this clean," he said finally. "I did it slow," I said. "Same thing when it counts." He left a small multi-tool on the table when he drove away. No note. In our world, gifts don't require explanations. They just rest where you'll reach for them when something jams. At 0600 hours the next morning, I wrote the last entry in my notebook. Mission: protect intent. Status: complete. Collateral: none. Lessons: silence carries far when you let it. I closed the cover and felt the weight. It wasn't heavy. That's how you know you carried it right. Laura and I meet on first Sundays now. We pay the taxes, we check the gutters, we disagree about paint colors and agree about what matters. The house breathes, the oak holds, the flag waits for weather and for days that deserve it. I didn't win. Winning suggests somebody had to lose. I kept faith with a man who taught me to tie a rope tight enough for duty and loose enough for mercy. I kept faith with a town that tells stories and, sometimes, learns to retell them closer to the truth. I kept faith with silence. Not every war ends with applause. Some wars end when the room goes quiet and stays that way, when the paper says what the heart said first, when the locks match the keys you were given, not the ones you forced. I served my country, then I served my father. In both places, radios crackled and men promised and records mattered. In both places, honor wasn't a speech. It was a habit. Some wars only end when the truth is recognized.